Now I'd like to introduce our first panel. Here to talk about the intersection of resilience and climate change are Hardeep Anand, Deputy Director, Miami-Dade County Water and Sewer Department. Dr. Samantha Danchuk, Assistant Director, Broward County Environmental Planning and Community Resilience. And you guys can start making your way up to the stage if you'd like. Alan Dodd, Director of Resilience and Public Works Department, City of Miami. Katie Hageman, Resilience Program Manager, Adaption, Miami-Dade. And our very own Mitch Herkus, who is our Route 50 Senior Editor and Director of Strategic Initiatives, who's going to moderate.
All right, thank you. Appreciate it. And let's have another hand for Noah Valenstein. Great. We appreciate you coming down to join us today. I'm excited for this panel. I'm excited to talk about this here in Miami. Actually, resiliency is one of the first things I worked on in my career from a policy and advocacy standpoint up in Washington, D.C., working with local communities on issues of shore protection and things like that. So it goes way back. I'm not going to say how old I am, but it goes way back to earlier in my career, I should say. And I'm excited to talk with some people who know far more about it, especially at the local level, particularly, than I do today. I guess a good place to start is finding out a little bit about you all in the audience real quick. How many of you work in the field of resilience in one way or another? Okay, good. How many of you are in the public sector? Oh, even better. Okay, great. And how many of you have met our speakers before? About half. Okay, I like this. Good. So we're going to try and pry a few things out of them and hopefully get time for your questions as well. Just to start off, you all can keep this kind of short because apparently everyone knows you guys. But tell us a little bit about how you all got involved in the world of resiliency. And we'll just start closest with me, with Katie.
Okay, I grew up in Massachusetts on the coast, and my favorite places are all within a meter of sea level. So through my work, I was in environmental advocacy and policy making, and then went back to school right as Hurricane Sandy hit. And so I got involved in the Rebuild by Design, part of the recovery effort for reimagining how some of our communities could be designed to better weather those storms. I had, just through coincidence, a boyfriend that was displaced by Katrina in New Orleans. My roommate in grad school lost her parents and her grandparents' house in Sandy. And so I've seen a lot of people firsthand experience what those kinds of storms can do. And obviously we can rebuild, but it's better, as someone said, not to be punched the first time. So that's one of the motivators for me in thinking about this kind of work.
I'll be interested to talk to you a little bit about some of the comparisons to some of the other Massachusetts and some others. Alan?
Okay, so my career started with the Army and the Corps of Engineers, where I was involved with a couple different responses to hurricanes. And somehow I ended up in Florida dealing with Everglades restoration, where I really learned about how it connected the natural environment and the built environment are, and the importance of dealing with climate change. So when I finally retired, I came to Fort Lauderdale initially. Worked with Dr. Nancy Gassman, who's sitting back over here, has really taught me a whole lot about the importance of resilience and dealing with sea level rise, and have taken those lessons that I've got from Fort Lauderdale down to the city of Miami.
All right.
You don't look retired.
It's the hair.
Sam?
Good morning. So Samantha Danchuk. I grew up in Florida. I'm a Florida native of Jupiter, and I studied in Louisiana and moved there about 2 weeks before Hurricane Katrina hit. And then really my first major position was responding to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and that was my expertise, oil spill modeling, so it was a right fit. But it taught me a lot about the role of local government, and then how quickly you need support when you have these disasters, and it's really hard for the federal government and the state to move quickly to address those issues. And they rely, local government relies really heavily on its consultants and having plans in place in order to respond quickly. So I came home immediately wanting to make sure that South Florida was prepared for oil spills because a lot of the modeling I had done in Louisiana pertained to sea level rise. It was kind of a natural fit to make sure that we were prepared for our next major urgent need.
Yeah. And Hardeep, what about you?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So, it's interesting you asked this question until I heard the other speakers speak. I've been followed by water. I think I was born in Tanzania, East Africa, coastal community, raised in London for a very little time, but then moved to India, which is, again, a peninsula, different kind of a water crisis there. Some places have a lot of water, some have very little water quality issues. And then come here in a native Floridian actually now for 22, 23 years. And again, it's water everywhere, right? So that's the common theme. On a career front, I started off as a consultant, became a regulator, worked as the director of public works in Fort Lauderdale, looking at infrastructure. And then come here to oversee a very large capital improvement program. And I think it kind of became very organic for me to just as Secretary Wellston said, the importance of ensuring that when we build infrastructure, it's important to look at risks and how do you mitigate risks and adapt to the environment and so on and so forth. So it's kind of grown very organically into me.
Cool. And so the next thing I want to touch on with you all is the Secretary mentioned a little bit around data and the importance of common data. So let's talk a little bit about where we are according to the data as you all have seen it. And we'll start with Hardeep on the end, and we'll kind of work our way this way. I promise we won't keep going in line the whole time, but I kind of want to, we'll start down there. What are you hearing as far as data? What stands out to you? I'm sure you could rattle off data all day, but if you were going to take a statistic or two that influences your job more than anything, and how you're applying reality to the data that you're seeing from where you sit.
So, I tend to rely a lot on the data that is already published with respect to, let's say, climate change and sea level rise without trying to reinvent that process. My focus has been on the concept of operationalizing resilience always, which is how do we get it done, right? I mean, there's a whole lot of effort going on with various shocks and stresses as one can define resilience. So, we focus on my end, at least I focus on that concept. And as it comes to data, I think where my efforts have been lately is to find a way to integrate data from various operational data silos that probably exist. An example would be asset management systems, infrastructure assets. We've got hydraulic and process models. We get a lot of data from telemetric systems or SCADA systems. And at the end of the day, if you're able to conglomerate this data, I don't like to use the word big data very often because it's become some sort of an industry buzzword. But I think the industry is moving there in terms of how do you make cohesive decisions. Again, when you come together as one entity, as one unit, rather than making decisions around one data silo. So there's a lot of work to be done there, and I think as the water sector is transforming itself with the use of more data, digital sensors, sensor technologies, both on the quality as well as on the infrastructure side, this is work in progress. I think there's a lot more work to be done there as we integrate and unify these data silos.
Do you feel, and I just want to follow up on this real quick, and I might ask Alan to follow up on this. Do you feel the operational data you're receiving is timely enough and accurate enough to make the sort of decisions, especially with the changing nature of what we're talking about here with climate change and resilience?
I think so. I think there's a lot more opportunity still for us to mine this data. And I bring this up almost on a day in and day out basis. But I think as you peel the onion back, we've got to do a lot more work in our sector with respect to data integrity as it relates to data mining. So for example, is the data set repeatable? What are the methodologies behind the data sets? Is there enough data governance that we have placed? If you translate this or look at the analogy in the health insurance space or in the marketing space or even in the banking industry, they are pretty mature when it comes to making business decisions around data. So I think there's still a lot more room, a lot more work to be done. But on a day-to-day basis, I think I would lean to say that I think we are pretty reliable. We've got good, reliable data. I think the next step is to proactively be able to use that to predict infrastructure failures. And I think that is where we need to go in terms of being able to use historical data, use data that exists, and how are you able to predict? So for example, are we able to use some of the infrastructure data to predict maintenance issues before it happens? we've got a lot of data that happens based on historical instances of events that happen. Now, if I can take that, and if we fixed a pipe, let's say, n instances of time over a period of 2 or 5 years or 10 years, and I know that something else is going to happen, then we've got to start programming that piece of pipe for capital infrastructure replacement rather than continuing to repair it. And I think that is where our efforts are focused now.
Okay, Alan, since you are probably the next most operational in line or on par in operations and having your own infrastructure, I wanted to touch base with you on this first. Is that a similar situation for yourself?
Well, absolutely. And if you look at the technology that is out there now, the ability to model different type of storm scenarios, sea level rise, and the impacts it will have in neighborhoods, we're able to predict what infrastructure needs we have 30 or 40 years from now that we couldn't have done 10 years ago. And that's been a huge focus within our department, is really looking at what data sets are out there, whether it's come from NOAA, from the Water Management District, from WASD, and how do we integrate all that into our models so that we're making wise decisions on infrastructure investments.
And Sam, you take a broader view in your role in Broward County. What kind of data sets are you looking at? And I'm sure there's thousands out there. How do you distill what's most important and what you can make most actionable?
Sure. So I think one trend that stood out and changed kind of our next policy was the fact that for every foot of sea level rise, there's a foot of groundwater rise, meaning that there's no longer the capacity in the coastal areas for the rain to percolate into the soil. We've lost that drainage space, and it will continue to get worse. So as we think about the western communities having more precipitation and more rainfall to deal with and needing to discharge that quicker through our canals, and then the eastern communities really not having any additional drainage space, we've kind of constrained the amount of water management the existing water management system that we have. And so we've started to put policies in place in our land use plan to plan for the future and not just based on historic conditions.
And Katie?
Yeah, I'll just add, I think I have a background in science, and I enjoy the discussion with the modelers and with the scientists about which model is better, and spend actually a lot of time on that. But I think, to use storm surge as an example, we have in Miami-Dade County, I think something like 5 or 6 different storm surge models that have all been run. And though it's interesting to talk about the differences, they all tell us that we're very prone to storm surge, and we should take action on that. I think, as Hardeep mentioned, the harder part is motivating people to understand, okay, outside on our front street here, we could see 3 feet of water in the street in the event of a hurricane. Now, what do we do with that information? And whether it's 3 or 4.5 or 2.5, it really doesn't matter. The nuances are important for design, of course, but we, big picture, have a lot of exposure, and the bigger question is, how do you move on that information?
Yeah, and one of the things that kind of brings me to one of my other points. I think this is, on the national level, obviously a politically charged issue of climate change and resiliency. But the truth is, it's a different conversation here locally, and frankly around the country, it's a different conversation when it's local to you. But there's still politically diverse views about how to approach it. With the compact locally, Florida, especially this region, has been able to kind of bridge some of those gaps and kind of create a coordinated approach. What do you think is behind the ability to create a common approach, and what suggestions would you give to others about coordination across multiple jurisdictions? And frankly, if you say, you can also tell us what's wrong with it or what doesn't work about it very well as well. Katie, you can start. I'm going to put you on the spot. You're next to me.
Well, I think others maybe could speak a little bit better to the compact, but I think the impacts of sea level rise are so obvious. Given the way that we're built, you really don't need to be an expert to understand if we add 3 feet of water to this landscape, it's going to look quite different. So I think that part, it's so touchable, and also hurricanes are well understood, and I think that also helps lend to the urgency. But I'm sure others could speak better about the compact who've been involved evolve longer.
Feel free to.
I'll just say quickly, so, people have more faith in regional resilience standards, assuming that the vetting has already been done and people are signing on. Quick example, when we were first putting forward the Unified Sea Level Rise projection, I went to every commission meeting and had to give a presentation to get them to adopt this projection. And I had some small cities where literally the commissioner was telling me, everything you're saying goes against my personal beliefs, but I will adopt this projection because I know it's for the common good. So I think that happens, and we've had cities today that are asking us to do more and more with the seawall policy that we're moving forward because they would like the county to, bear that burden so that they can adopt what works for their city but not have the same kind of pressure from the public.
And well, Hardy, go ahead.
I was just going to add, you mentioned about unification, I think moving together is on one front, and piggybacking on what the Secretary said about, one DEP, one Florida, I think along the concept of one community. I think the challenge for us is when you define the word resilience, it means different things to different folks, right? I mean, if you look at someone in an economically poor community, the word resilience there would be, can I get to work in the aftermath of a storm? Are my streets flooded? Versus to someone else, it could be, can I flush my toilets, and is the wastewater going anywhere? And if I open my faucet, am I getting clean water? And in the context of an industry, it could be, is my manufacturing sector is going to be shut down? So I think if you start with the definition on a common front, and then start looking at it in terms of a risk, in terms of what that risk would be posing, and look at it from a community standpoint at the end of the day, because it's the community at the end of the day that needs to sustain this conversation. Our elected official cycles change, our political cycles change, our priorities could change, and it should be, our capital plans should be probably dynamic and nimble enough to adapt to the changing landscape of a regulatory environment. For example, today we're talking about emerging threats and contaminants, we're talking about PFASs and PFOAs. So you've got to be always adaptive and dynamic. And I think one of the areas that I'd like to share, which we're working on very aggressively, is with the Rockefeller Foundation and the 100 Resilient Cities, is the City Water Resilience Framework. And if you really look at the first phase of the work that has been completed, and you look at the governance behind water and how it is fragmented across various jurisdictions, and how do we come together as all of these jurisdictions looking at it under the one water concept? Right? There's no water, it's no wastewater, there's no storm water, there's no groundwater, surface water, it's just one water if you follow the life cycle of water. So I think at the end of the day, if you're able to have these integrated approaches to infrastructure planning, embedded and backed by sound data in a collaborative fashion with the community and the elected officials and everybody else joined to it, then I think, in my humble opinion, we would have a plan that is sustainable over time. It would not change if Hardeep leaves or if someone else comes in, right? So I think that's one way to slice and dice that complex problem, and we are getting there. And there's a lot of work happening behind the scenes with various entities, the Compact, the Chamber, and all of those folks working aggressively.
Alan, just real quick, the city has actually had quite a strong level of support for, they just invested in a huge bond initiative, for instance, hundreds of billions of dollars to put forward towards resiliency when it comes to sewers and all. Where is that, talk a bit about that community support and what it takes. Does it take something to sustain it? Is it internal? Is it leadership? Where does that come from?
I think it's all of the above, what you mentioned. And for the folks who don't know, the city of Miami, about a year and a half ago now, passed the Miami Forever Bond to put $400 million into resilience. About $192 million is towards flooding issues and challenges, $100 million towards affordable housing, and the rest gets spread into various other areas. But the only reason that we were able to do that was because of the voters passed it, and our elected officials had the will and the foresight to explain to everybody what changes we needed to make. And I think that demonstrates leadership when you're able to take very abstract concepts of where Miami will be, what it will look like 30 or 40 years from now, and explain to all of our residents so that everybody agrees that we have to do something, we need to start now. And we were able to pull in a lot of expertise from the 100 resilient cities, from different agencies and organizations to help us to make that case to the people that it's worth investing in resilience.
So I want to ask a little bit more of an angled question here, and anyone can jump in on this. Who's your resiliency spirit animal, so to speak? What region, what person, where in the country is someone doing something really exciting that you look at and you say, we need to learn from them?
Jennifer Hirado.
I've never called her our resilient spirit animal, but I'll take that back.
Yeah.
She's from Broward County, for those who don't know.
Well, I think the original founders of the compact, right? So Susie Torienti, all of the kind of original Jim Murley. I mean, there was a specific group that supported the elected officials at the time that the compact was formed, and that really has driven a lot of the policy and the work that has continued. They have personal relationships so that, the compact has lasted 10 years, and although they've changed roles, it's given the opportunity for then whoever fills that role to kind of participate in the compact as well. So I think it's a great model. I have to think about my other.
Do you have any?
I was just going to echo with Susie Toriente. Worked very closely with her, and she's been very instrumental in the compact. But on the utility side, a gentleman by the name of George Hawkins, who I look up to as a mentor with DC Water. Great work DC Water has done in this sector. So we always look forward to the work they're doing to try and see how we can mimic some of it.
Alan, do you have one?
Okay, I would just throw, like I said earlier, Nancy Gaspin here, who it's about connecting with people and explaining to folks. And I've never seen anybody better at connecting with the audience and be able to talk through community concerns at a street-by-street level.
Yeah. I wanted to talk a little bit about Chief Resiliency Officers because unfortunately Jennifer wasn't able to make it. Susie also had a flight issue that came up. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to make it. But, it gives me an opportunity to ask a question that I may not have been able to ask. I used to work with Chief Information Officers in one of my previous roles. One of the troubles that they have is they have a large responsibility and roles. Some have more governance and authority than others. That's been a persistent problem across the country with Chief Resiliency Officers. Some have the ability or the backing of a strong mayor to say, we need to do this now and you need to listen to this person. Others don't have that, or as politics change, they don't have as strong an ability. We see that Florida's hiring one now. What advice would you have, or what have you seen that works as far as creating good authorities that bring senior leadership on board? Is it just a mayor saying you have to listen to this person, or a county executive in the case for many of you? Or is there other things that can be worked in? I'm going to open it up to anyone.
I would, from my vantage point, I would say, I think, the CROs alone cannot do it, right? So you really have to embed this within the organization, and it becomes a part of the learning process. So most progressive organizations, at least in the public sector, in the private sector, you'll see chief learning officers, chief technology officers, chief innovation officers, chief data officers. And I think it starts from there, rather than having generic titles. I mean, one would say, what's in a CRO? But it makes a big difference. And then as you organically translate this into the organization, the learning happens. But I think, let's take a forum like this. We've got to find ways and mediums to take what comes out of these forums and then translate that horizontally, vertically into organizations, government and private. And together, when the conversation goes down to the 2,600 employee in water and sewer, or 26,000 employees within the county, I think then it translates into every sector of that organization. For example, procurement. We've got to start looking at green procurement strategies, right? We've got to start looking at green infrastructure. So how do you make that happen? Financial resilience, public-private partnerships. And I think as you start having these conversations within the organization, I think that momentum will come, but it'll take some time.
I would just say that a chief resilience officer cannot do anything unless they get all the departments on board, and having that relationship. The first person I had lunch with when I came to Miami was our chief resilience officer, and we talked for about 2 hours about at the strategic level what the city is trying to achieve, and then how to operationalize it down within the public works department. And she's had those type of conversations with every department and is really an integrator of everything that we're trying to achieve within the city. But that's the type of person you need, someone who can bring together different departments and different priorities and focuses to achieve a common effort.
I would just add really quickly, I would hire the most forward-thinking person you can find for each department, because while the chief resiliency officer can organize the conversation and be consistent in messaging, if you have someone that's willing to be innovative and take on new projects, and then you have someone on their team that has the capacity to apply for grants, a lot of the innovation within our county is a result of technical assistance and grants that were awarded.
Okay, do you have anything to add? I have a question for you. You mentioned Hurricane Sandy. You mentioned Massachusetts. They've also, their recent experiences have kind of jutted them into action as well. How was some of the experiences, and Sam, I'd like you to kind of chime in on this as well, that you've seen other places differed, and also what commonalities and differences do you see here in this region, and what are you hoping, where can we learn from each other more broadly across the country, and what are areas where each area is going to, each region or city is going to have to go it alone a bit more?
I think for me, one of the things that's still really surprising, and in the wake of Sandy, I had a close friend who has a waterfront view in New Jersey, and she was like, well, we didn't know we were in the floodplain. And I'm like, well, I don't think you know what the floodplain is then, because you can, and I've had a very similar conversation here in Miami. Someone expressed, and it's not just one person, it happens a lot. People don't really understand the connection, and that water can come up in a storm. Of course, many people do, but it's sometimes really humbling to remember that many people, even with waterfront views or adjacent to a canal, don't really understand the gravity of what could happen in a storm. So I think the education part is a big challenge that unifies everyone. I have a good friend that started a nonprofit in New Orleans focused on spreading what he calls water literacy to kids, and teaching kids in New Orleans about how the water system works, how the canal system works, and the pumps. And I think we need we have a lot of good work going on in that front, and I think that's a great use of time and energy. I think, each place, Florida has such a unique hydrology. We have water on all sides. We have water on the west, water under our feet, and of course, being in the tropics, we can always have a heavy rain event, and we have the Atlantic. So, we have water on all sides, and I think helping people understand how those are all interconnected, as Sam mentioned, with the sea level rise, we have the groundwater rise, and that affects all of our communities, not just Miami Beach. It affects Sweetwater, Doral, our inland communities that depend on the water management system in order to keep them dry in a storm. So that is a unique challenge. The specifics are unique, but the broader challenge, I think, is shared. And but fortunately, we have lots of good work going on in that front, and we try and borrow from each other as much as possible. We have a consultant, for example, that's working for us that did the New York plan, and we have no problem just stealing exactly what they've been working on.
Best part about public sector, you can steal liberally.
Sure. I'll just add, California has really led the emissions reduction strategies. There's a lot we can learn from them about what has worked and not worked. And, they're tackling urban heat as well, which we really have not gotten too far along on in South Florida. In Texas, they've been investing in hazard modeling. I was working on that 15 years ago, and they did it for the entire state. So I'd like to see our state to follow suit and looking regionally at what our vulnerabilities are. And I think, we're looking forward to the South Atlantic Coastal Study coming to South Florida, or our Southeast region. And there's a lot to learn from the work that they had done in the Northeast. So there's a lot of models we'll be following.
Hardeep, I want to ask you about something you brought up real quick. You mentioned procurement. And procurement's kind of a sticky wicket because it's set up in a way to try and avoid mistakes. And that means that it's easiest to buy things you've already bought from people you've already worked with, that have been vetted and used by other people before. That tends to hold things back, right? It makes it harder to be innovative or new. And the same is somewhat true with land use policy, right? Talk a bit about some of the ways, so what would some of your recommendations be for folks, whether they be in the procurement space or otherwise, for trying new things? You've mentioned some of the data work you all have been doing. How do you get everyone to go along in the same direction when it comes to those sort of things?
I'm going to run the risk of saying a few things that might be disruptive.
We love that. We love that. That's good.
You know, we're talking about one community, one DEP, moving on a resilient front, doing things together. I think one idea would be that when we have focus groups like these or conferences like ours, we should invite folks from the procurement industry. The procurement industry does conferences on their own. We do conferences on our own, but I think the timing is right where we bring the executives from the procurement world into our world. That would be suggestion number one. Suggestion number two would be, I think we've got to find a way to incentivize certain opportunities because the green infrastructure market is not the cheapest, right? There's a cost of doing business. And at the end of the day, we look at our costs in a very linear, one-dimensional model, meaning what does it cost me to do A? But if you look at it from a triple bottom line, the cost of doing A from a social, economic, environmental aspect of sustainability principles, that cost might be far more beneficial to the community because now you're looking at emissions, you're looking at all kinds of various aspects that we really don't do a very good job today. We look at it purely from a cost standpoint. So I think if you start, an example would be, you know, if you're managing stormwater in the first place and it's not making it into your wastewater systems, you have a ripple effect downstream in terms of chemicals, in terms of energy savings, in terms of operational costs, infrastructure maintenance. And if you're able to take all of those costs and quantify it and then compare apples to apples to say, you know what, this green infrastructure here makes sense. An example would be pervious pavers. An example would be bioswales, traditionally a little bit more expensive than green swales. So I think there's a whole lot of conversation on that that needs to be had.
If I could just chime in, I just recently completed a 3-year procurement for a $600,000 planning study with no construction involved. So I know that the procurement system that we have right now is cumbersome. We have some great examples, though, with the partnership through Rockefeller, through 100 Resilient Cities, and that partnership allows us to bring in experts and innovative firms through that partnership without necessarily going through the full public sector procurement. We've also have really close relationship with the Kresge Foundation that has been very generous with this region, and they have made very good strategic investments in resilience across the region. It's allowed us to do things like the Arch Creek study in North Miami and partner with ULI and others, again, through the support of the foundation. So that's a recommendation I would have, is that good working relationship with the foundations can also help bring in the innovation and new ideas much quicker.
I would just say that the key to it is recognizing that things are moving faster, and throughout government we need to be more nimble and flexible in not only procurement but how we design things as well. When it takes 2 or 3 years to design a piece of infrastructure, it's too long. If we can cut back on that time through design build or other ways, build a little bit more adaptability in the overall design for the future, where we can change and modify it as conditions change, we can deliver faster for the people that we're here to serve.
And just real quick, this kind of goes to something that was alluded to a little bit. How do we ensure that green design doesn't become something for the rich? It's an equitable thing where it's kind of spread across, so everyone, it's not that you're buying into a community that necessarily is the only one that can afford it. How do we ensure that resiliency is equitable?
In the city of Miami, we have more than 450 capital projects that are going on right now. Every single one of them will have a community engagement aspect as we're going through the design of it to get that feedback. We are, from a design standards view, we're forcing green aspects to be included in the designs, because not only is it more cost effective in some ways when you put in trees versus a stormwater pipe, but it enhances the quality of life as well.
So at the county, primarily we have authority over the unincorporated area, which also happens to be, some of the low and moderate income area. And so I think by doing pilot projects there, focusing a lot of our energy and attention in those areas, they get the benefit, and hopefully that's a model for the other cities as well.
I want to make sure we get a couple questions from the audience. Does anyone have a question that they'd like to? I see this gentleman in the front row. Mike's coming around. If you could just tell us a little bit where you're from and question.
Good morning, Benjamin. I work with EBS Engineering. I live in Miami here for over 30 years. So this is very personal when we talk about resiliency and water issues. I've been through Hurricane Andrew, which was the most powerful around here. And of course, the other ones that have passed recently. I have some questions, but I would start with the first one that I think is the most important, since the Secretary of Environmental Issues in Florida is here. Should the state take a more regional approach to fund resiliency studies and development of mitigation or common mitigation strategies? That's the first question. Should the state, so that we do it instead of Miami has one, and Borough had one, we do it in a kind of a regional basis, Southwest Florida, Southeast Florida, Northeast Florida, and all that. They have solid funding so that the science that we have from this would be used to develop common mitigation strategies for each of these regions.
So I think the question is, I know there's a regional compact, but should there be a state role? I think we can only handle one question, but should there be a state role in kind of funding it? Is that the question?
That's the question.
I would add that I think the South Florida Water Management District, the water management districts are a great venue for those kind of regional studies. And we have a new era at the district that's starting, so perhaps that's also an opportunity.
I'll just say, so DEP through some NOAA grants has already funded a lot of our vulnerability studies, and a lot of the work that's been done has come through the state, so they've already been an existing funding partner, and sure, increasing the amount of funding that they provide so we can do additional studies would always be wonderful. But for example, Mr. Valenstein had referenced the boat ramp adaptation project. So those are all examples of projects that they're currently funding that are useful for us. And I think the water management district level is a great level to kind of assess our different watersheds.
I would just say after Hurricane Andrew, the state took the lead and we changed building standards based on the need to be more wind resilient. As we're looking at these future challenges, the state should take that overarching lead to develop the strategy, but implementation really happens more at the local level. So there's going to have to be a give and take as to how much is dictated or controlled by the state versus how much we do at the city and the county level to make sure that we're adapting it to our particular needs.
Okay, let's see if there's another question. Oh.
Thank you. I'm from the city of Gainesville, a city commissioner there, and this is a little bit off a tangent, but I heard you talking about housing as being one of the items that is being included in the discussion. And with the amount of new construction that's going on, I'm wondering how many communities are using glass in their concrete slabs or in the asphalt, or, with the current pullback from China for a lot of our recyclables, we're having this as a major discussion going on about how we can be more local with our recycling, and glass can be used in a lot of different ways, and I'm wondering who's using that innovatively in their community.
Is there, so you're asking about changing construction techniques, utilizing
Glass and roads. Just think of every slab that could be maybe 1/5 glass.
Have you all explored
We really haven't in the city of Miami. Definitely something we can look at, but it has not been part of any of the planning or the design that we've done so far.
They're stealing sand off of beaches across the world now.
I know Palm Beach County, their waste manager has done glass fault for many, many decades now. That's the only example I can think. We don't have a county policy, and I'm not aware of city policies.
All right, let's do one more question out in the back there.
Sure, thank you. I'm Britt Harder with Guidehouse. Are the current programs underway sufficient to manage the challenge at hand? And if not, what would be sufficient?
I think we need many more people involved for it to be sufficient. I think obviously we're working on this all day, every day, and we have a great head start. But as mentioned before, this isn't something that just affects one industry, even it affects our water, building materials, the whole gamut. And we have in Miami an amazing amount of people involved, from our architects to engineers, all professional disciplines engaged. But of course, that needs to be ramped up. So if I can make a quick plug, we're doing our sea level rise strategy at the county level. We have 3 workshops coming up in April and a number coming up in the spring. So if you are a resident and would like to get involved, we would really appreciate it. So our website, we have that information. But we feel that it's very important to get a bigger tent moving forward.
And if I could add on to that, it's not an exact science, and the more we have these type of conversations at the local, national, and international level, the more we start to coalesce around a common vision, a goal that we're heading to. Our mayor made this one of his top priorities. He is signed up to be on the lead of the environmental board within the League of Mayors. He's on the UN Commission for Climate Adaptation as one of their representatives. So we're making a very important priority, but we know we can't do it as a city. We have to work with partners at every level to get the expertise to come up with a good plan.
So I'll just add, I'd like to see the ownership shift, not so much from local government to the individuals. So property owners should be responsible for knowing if they're in the floodplain and what floodproofing is about. Developers should be responsible for designing long-term sustainable development. Every time I poll during a workshop, everybody says it's local government's responsibility. And so sitting on the inside, I'm like, really? Because we're not the ones that can do it all.
All right. Well, I think the timer's a little bit off here. I think we need to take a quick break now, a networking break, take about 5-10 minutes. We'll call you guys back, and we're going to have a great panel coming up and a great closing speaker, so stick around. Thanks, guys. Thanks to our panel again.